Welcome to Rock Center Shorts. I'm Kristen Savell, Managing Director of the Rock Center for Corporate Governance at Stanford. I am very excited to have with me today Ari Redbord, Head of Legal and Government Affairs at TRM Labs, which is a blockchain analytics company that helps organizations detect, assess, and investigate crypto-related fraud and financial crime. Prior to joining TRM, Ari was the Senior Advisor to the Deputy Secretary and the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the United States Treasury. In that position, he worked with teams from the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, and other parts of Treasury to deploy sanctions and other regulatory tools against threat actors. Ari also worked on issues related to the Bank Secrecy Act, cryptocurrency, and anti-money laundering strategies. Prior to Treasury, Ari spent 11 years as Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Columbia. Welcome, Ari.
Kristen, it is so great to join you, and thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So today we're going to talk about the sanctions that OFAC issued against Tornado Cash. And to start things off, can you explain what Tornado Cash is and how it works?
Sure, absolutely. And again, thanks so much for having me. Look, the Tornado Cash sanctions are extraordinary. And sort of what Tornado Cash is really gets to the heart of that, right? Tornado Cash is a decentralized Ethereum-based mixing service. So essentially, it's software, but it's software that lives on a blockchain and allow users to mix funds to essentially either obfuscate or gain privacy on transactions. And why is this extraordinary? It's extraordinary really because it's the first time that OFAC ever sanctioned software. You know, this isn't an entity, this isn't a person, this is a decentralized software protocol that all kinds of different people can use. And I think where sort of the paradox here lays in a lot of the interesting conversation is in the fact that North Korea was using Tornado Cash in a really meaningful way. It was the go-to obfuscation technique by North Korea cyber criminals to launder the proceeds of hacks and other financial crime. And that was why Treasury sanctioned it. It wanted to sort of take out the ability of North Korea to use this mixing service to obfuscate funds. But on the other side, there were a lot of regular users, legitimate users, who were using Tornado Cash to build in a degree of privacy in a more and more open financial system. We can sort of get to the uses in a moment, but that's really kind of where the debate has taken off since the designation. And it's really this question of sort of privacy versus security and how this is all going to play out.
Do you have a sense of what percentage of the activity on Tornado Cash, at least pre-sanctions, was licit versus illicit?
Look, I think that there's a range here likely, and the range is somewhere in the 30 to 40% illicit activity, which means obviously, 60% or so was licit according to TRM. And again, we're sort of a blockchain intelligence company. And what we do is we work with, crypto businesses and financial institutions to provide the data they need to mitigate risk, whether it's sanctions exposure or other types of risk. We're able to identify about $1 billion of funds that have gone through Tornado Cash that are just associated with North Korea. We have been able to sort of see that Tornado Cash was used in North Korea's 10 largest hacks. So, again, it's this same issue where you have an illicit actor taking advantage of a decentralized protocol of software, but at the same time, regular users are also using it who are now sort of ensnared in these sanctions.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think OFAC didn't target hackers or other bad actors? Why target a protocol?
Yeah, no. So look, I think that this latest action sort of builds on really a year and a half, maybe more, of activity coming out of the Department of Justice and the U.S. Treasury Department. And OFAC really has, and not just OFAC, DOJ and Treasury and elsewhere across the government has focused on illicit actors. So if you look really sort of thinking through the types of entities that have been sanctioned or we've seen criminal prosecutions, we've seen what I sort of call, darknet advertising mixing services. These are centralized Bitcoin mixers. One was called Bitcoin Fog. One was called Helix. In those cases, the administrators, a guy named Larry Harmon for Helix and a guy named Sterling Gov for Bitcoin Fog, were actually charged. And Larry Harmon pled guilty to money laundering conspiracy for conspiring with Alpha Bay, a darknet market, to use a mixer to launder the proceeds of illicit activity. Clearly, an illicit actor within the crypto ecosystem. They also targeted what I sort of call non-compliant cryptocurrency businesses, virtual asset service providers like ChatX and SueX and Garantex, all Russia-based, all with no compliance controls. So they allowed ransomware and other types of illicit activity to flow through them. And then darknet markets like Silk Road, Alpha Bay, Hydra, that were allowing, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of illicit activity to flow through. Those were the targets before. And, I think and why Tornado Cash is so exceptional is because it builds on some of those designations, especially one called Blender.io, which was a mixing service that was also being used by North Korea, but very different in terms of scale, different in terms of centralization. But it can be seen as building on these different designations, but at the same time, this is really the first one that has sort of gone further because of that impact on individual users and the fact that it really is truly decentralized. There is no entity behind it per se. But I would say that to date, OFAC has been very targeted, almost scalpel-like, in going after illicit actors within the overall crypto economy. And kind of acknowledging that most of the crypto economy is licit. Tornado Cash sort of pushes that, but I will also say that, look, from OFAC's perspective, Tornado Cash was being used very aggressively by North Korea cyber criminals. And what you have to remember is, hacks are bad. People lose money, people lose their life savings, but they arguably become worse, certainly from a national security perspective, when that hack is perpetrated by a nation state actor that is using those funds. And some of those funds, huge amounts of money, $600 million hack on the Ronin blockchain, for example, North Korea was involved there. Those funds will be used for weapons proliferation, for ballistic missiles that could be fired at Guam or your other, places in the United States. So the reality is, I think we've seen hacks go from fraud and financial crime to true national security issues. And that's why you've seen sort of the aggressive posture from regulators as well.
Got it. That makes sense. So this is noteworthy because it's the first time a protocol has been sanctioned. But what does that actually mean in practice? Can you kind of walk us through that?
Sure. Yeah, no, it means a lot of different things. And what's sort of, look, on the one hand, regular users are probably going to be less likely to use Tornado Cash because of sort of the name and shame aspect of sanctions, right? No one wants to be engaging with a sanctioned entity, certainly not US users who are prohibited from transacting with Tornado Cash, certainly the addresses that are sanctioned. So obviously you have that. But at the same time, you have regular users who have either inadvertently received funds even post designation. And the real question are really, I think, twofold. One, how should those regular users respond? What should they do? What are their obligations? And then two, what now are crypto businesses, from everything from DeFi protocols to stablecoin issuers to centralized exchanges? What should they do in response to these sanctions? Look, at TRM, we work with crypto businesses across the crypto industry. Those I just mentioned, DeFi protocols, stablecoin issuers, centralized exchanges. And what they're doing right now is they are using our data, right? We're a data provider, we're providing software to make decisions as to which cryptocurrency addresses to block that are associated with Tornado Cash.
Right.
And there's a couple different ways they can do this. First, the question is, should you just block the addresses that are designated, that are on the sanctions list, the 45 addresses from Tornado Cash? And if you are a US entity or person, you are prohibited from engaging with those addresses. It's black and white. The really interesting question comes as to whether or not you should block addresses that have some exposure, that have transacted with those sanctioned addresses. And what we're seeing is, look, I mean, we're seeing some businesses decide to also block those sort of from a conservative risk-based approach. And you're seeing others say, hey, look, we need more guidance from regulators before we're going to sort of take that step and block addresses. We've also seen businesses sort of take a more granular approach to say, hey, we're not going to block every address that has transacted with Tornado Cash, because you have dusting, which is like these small amounts of crypto, or you have people who have received it, unsolicited, or you have, smaller amounts or dates that predate the sanctions designation. So what we do is we provide data that has all those things, timestamps, the amounts, so businesses could sort of make a more granular decision about whether or not to block certain addresses. But it's a hard choice. And look, I mean, sanctions sanctions, there are serious penalties for noncompliance in terms of enforcement actions, and it's just something to be very, very careful of. So I think that sort of like businesses today are trying to figure out what to do. And I'll finish with this. Look, I think the key right now is guidance from regulators. If you look, all the cryptocurrency businesses we speak to are all looking for something from OFAC or Treasury that really kind of helps them understand sort of what is their obligations, especially vis-a-vis those what we'll call secondary addresses, the ones that aren't on the SDN list, but have transacted with sanctioned addresses.
Right. So there have been some different responses from some of these providers, as you mentioned, with some trying to comply and some perhaps waiting for more information, most notably Tether. So I'm curious, Ari, do you think the government will go after Tether for failing to comply with the sanctions? And then part and parcel of that question, do you think Tether actually is required to comply, given that at least on its website, it claims that it's not a US person, doesn't operate in the United States, and doesn't onboard US persons as customers?
Yeah, sure. I promise you, I'm not dodging this question. I'll get to Tether in a second. But okay. I think one thing that's kind of really interesting and important to note is that really before Tornado Cash, to some degree, sanctions was kind of easy, right? Mm-hmm. Of all the sort of, compliance obligations that one had, and even in crypto where nothing is easy. If OFAC sanctioned an address, it was usually associated with terrorist financing. Okay. And everyone wanted to block that address. You don't want a terrorist financier engaging with your DeFi protocol or stablecoin, ecosystem. You want to block that address. And you know what? You actually probably also want to block the addresses that person has transacted with, because they're funding a terrorist financier. But that is what's so different about Tornado Cash, because there are addresses that are transacting with Tornado Cash that you don't want to block. And I think, look, what Tether is saying, and I am not a spokesperson for Tether by any stretch of the imagination, so I don't, I don't have the inside baseball, but my understanding of what they're saying is not that they are not going to abide by OFAC sanctions. My understanding is what they're saying is that we are not going to block those secondary addresses, those addresses that have transacted with Tornado Cash but are not on the SDN list. They are making pretty clear, at least in the statement that I read, that they are going to block the addresses that are actually on the sanctions list, because that is something they are clearly required to do. At least US persons or entities are required to do. And I think there's a little bit of question as to the fact that they're transacting with US persons or entities that they may have similar obligations. So I think that it's very clear that they're not saying they're not going to abide by sanctions. What they're saying is we're not going to block those secondary addresses, the addresses that have transacted with Tornado Cash, until we have more guidance from regulators. So I don't know if it's quite the story, that it would be if they said, hey, we're not going to comply with US sanctions at all. I don't think that's what we're seeing here. I think it's them trying to sort of take a little bit more maybe forward-leaning approach, but still not going all the way to say we're not going to abide by sanctions.
Right. And how should the regular users, I believe is the term you used, be responding to these sanctions? The people who are using Tornado Cash for legitimate purposes and now have their money blocked and can't access it.
Yeah, what should we call them? I've been trying for the last few days to try to figure out the right terminology. Look, legitimate users, non-illicit actors, but I would say, look, I mean, I think they're just regular people who are engaging with the crypto ecosystem. So that's why I sort of used that term. But I think for these folks, look, it's really tough. And I think to me, there is no world in which, and again, I'm not a treasurer anymore, so I could say things like this, but there is not a world in which OFAC is going to bring an enforcement action against someone who has inadvertently engaged with a sanctioned address. This idea where you can send funds to someone in small amounts, a dusting attack,
right?
Make a statement. To me, you should never be allowed or encouraged to use sanctions as an offensive weapon of some kind to make a statement. So the reality is that OFAC is never going to take action, but I do think we need to know that. And that's why guidance is so important. But to the heart of your question is sort of what should people do today to get their funds out of Tornado Cash? And I think that, look, engaging with OFAC is the answer as we speak right now. I think we will see guidance and FAQs around sort of how to handle these types of situations. But I think typically, this is one that's not all that different from any financial institution that's sanctioned, right? Are you in Iran? Did you have funds in an Iranian bank or the Russian central bank or wherever that is, or with a Russian company that's now designated post-Ukraine invasion? You need a license to engage with that entity. And that's essentially permission from OFAC. And I think what OFAC would say today is that you need a license to engage, and that is on a case-by-case basis. And there's a hotline, and you go through the process. And I think that's probably where things stand today in terms of getting your funds out.
Got it. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the implications of the Tornado Cash sanctions, and I want to start with a narrow focus and then widen our lens. So first, what are the implications of the sanctions for Tornado Cash? In other words, are the sanctions actually preventing users from engaging in transactions with the protocol?
Great question. So at least a week ago, the last time I looked or so, the website had been taken down for Tornado Cash, which essentially means that there isn't a sort of front end or a place where you can engage on the internet. Now, that's essentially the most centralized part of a decentralized protocol. I think that creates some friction for some users. That said, there are, the nature of Tornado Cash or any decentralized entity protocol is that you can engage with it outside of that interface, right? You go directly to the protocol, it's software, and you are still able to do that today. I think the other piece is, like any software, you can copy paste and create Hurricane Cash or Tsunami Cash, and people can engage with that. So, look, I think that, is Treasury creating some friction for Tornado Cash from this designation? Likely, but are we sort of in that game that regulators and law enforcement always play with, shell companies, essentially, this game of whack-a-mole? I think that's where we are. That's where we are as well. So the reality is users can still engage with it. I think that U.S. persons or entities should be very careful because they are clearly prohibited today from engaging with Tornado Cash. But the reality is it's still something that is certainly able to be done. I do think it'll be very interesting to see if North Korea state actors continue to use Tornado Cash to launder funds. And I think that's a big TBD. I think typically, bad actors do not want to go to places where the US government is shining a light. And we'll see if they sort of continue this. But yeah, I think that certainly users will continue to use it.
Okay, let's take one step back, and I'd like to get your opinion on the implications of the sanctions for other protocols like Tornado Cash that purport to solve for transactional privacy.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, post 9/11, we maybe even before 9/11, quite frankly, we've been in this world where the preeminent conversation has been around privacy versus security. And I think, previously that conversation happened in airports and, at borders. And today it's happening on blockchains. And potentially this designation, the legacy will be, this was sort of the most robust or the first robust conversation that we had about the importance of privacy versus security on blockchains. It's very clear that OFAC sees Tornado Cash as a serious national security concern. I think after the Ronin hack, sort of the posture of governments went from this is a fraud and financial crime problem to be investigated by the FBI to this is a national security threat to be handled by, the Treasury Department and sanctions. So, look, I think we're going to continue to see action. I will say that it is important to note that Tornado Cash was or is exceptional in the amount of funds that a dangerous state actor laundered through the protocol. It was the go-to money laundering concern for North Korea. Again, that does not mean we should impact regular users who are using it for their own privacy needs. And those needs are very real. Let me actually talk to those in a moment, in a second, because I think that it's important. Like, people ask me all the time, well, why would anyone use a mixer other than to launder money? And the reality is that there are more and more reasons to use privacy enhancing tools as we transact in a more and more open financial system, right? There's a world in which, you're going to be paid, Kristen, by Stanford in crypto. And in order to do that, they're going to have your wallet address. Well, do you want Stanford to see every transaction, how you spend your paycheck, every month? Maybe, maybe not, likely not. There are so many public figures now that share their ETH address, right? And those people, you can watch every transaction that address does. So I think there's going to be more and more needs for this type of privacy. And the real line that regulators like OFAC are going to have to walk is, well, we're all going to have to walk together, really, is how do we keep illicit actors from engaging in this new financial system, but at the same time, allow regular users to have some degree of privacy in a more and more open financial system. And I think we're going to see how that plays out, over the next, probably months and years.
What do you think the right way is to balance those two interests between privacy and law enforcement's need for transparency?
Yeah, look, I promise this is not self-serving, but I think there's a technology solution to this, right? We work with law enforcement, we work with crypto businesses to provide data to help them make informed decisions. And I think the reality is, this is a technology issue, and I think there's a technology solution. I think we can avoid sort of overregulation by allowing businesses to sort of take a granular approach, really trying to understand sort of what is their risk, use tools to mitigate those risks, and to continue to allow regular users to transact. There is always going to be fraud and financial crime in crypto. There is more fraud and financial crime in the traditional financial system, by magnitudes and magnitudes and magnitudes than exist in crypto today. There's always going to be fraud and financial crime. We're not trying to solve for that, right? We're not trying to get rid of that. But what we are trying to do is mitigate it. I think one thing that's sort of missed in some of this is, look, take North Korea entirely out of the equation here, right? Let's say this is not a hair on fire national security issue. What we are doing here is building a new financial system. We want people to engage with DeFi protocols, with bridges, right? With centralized exchanges. We want people to engage with the crypto economy. People aren't going to do that if they think that tomorrow their funds can disappear from DeFi, from a bridge. And none of this is going to work. In the age of the internet, a hack meant, the loss of usernames and passwords. In the age of crypto, a hack means the loss of life savings, right? You're stealing money at the speed of the internet. And those are real people's money. Those people are not going to put their money back or put more money on a protocol if they think they're going to lose it. And I think that, so the key here is we have to stop North Korea. We have to stop hackers from attacking the new crypto economy, or it's not going to work. And I think part of that is stopping their ability to launder funds. Now, again, like, the nuanced issue here is you also don't want to ensnare regular users in that process. But I think there's a technology solution here. And I think we're already seeing, DeFi protocols and other crypto businesses, start to kind of take a more tailored approach to risk management.
One additional question just in terms of implications of the sanctions at our widest lens here. What do you see as the implications, I think, for the broader crypto ecosystem? If a protocol can be sanctioned and if providers can comply with those sanctions, should this alter our fundamental understanding of what crypto actually is? And I will note that in the wake of the sanctions, one researcher described the crypto space as, quote, centralized systems powered by centralized entities that simply abrogate their responsibilities unless threatened by a powerful regulatory authority like OFAC, unquote.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's different aspects to crypto, just like there is different aspects to any financial system. And you have some very centralized pieces to it. You have cryptocurrency businesses that operate like very much like traditional financial institutions. They hold funds. But then you also have a much more decentralized piece. I think that's the promise of DeFi, right? It's on-chain financial services that allow people to transact peer-to-peer, that don't rely on traditional financial institutions for loans and staking and other types of activity. So I think that, look, I think like anything else, there's a mix today of centralized and decentralized aspects to it. What is the Tornado Cash designation going to mean? Look, I think it means a couple things. One, I think it means that OFAC is very focused, or Treasury is very focused. Really, the U.S. government is very focused on the space right now, and trying to ensure that illicit actors are not taking advantage of it. I do think that going after an entity like Tornado Cash will be the exception, not the rule. I do think that Tornado Cash was exceptional in some ways for the amount of illicit activity that was flowing through, particularly involving North Korea, which has been the focus of the last several sanctions actions in the crypto space that OFAC has taken. So I think that, I'm not saying this is an isolated approach. And I think what we heard from Treasury is that more sanctions on mixers are likely coming from their release around Tornado Cash. I don't know if that's going to be reevaluated or sort of how this is all going to go. But I will say that Tornado Cash was exceptional in the way it was being used by illicit actors. And I think that that's something that's probably important to know. That's why I think the next sort of couple steps that Treasury and OFAC, DOJ take will maybe inform maybe allow me to provide a little bit better answer to your question.
All right, I'm going to put you on the spot here, Ari. I promise I won't be mad if you refuse to answer.
Yeah.
Did OFAC make the right call here?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. I spent about 2 years at Treasury working sort of on terrorism and financial in the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. And one thing I could certainly tell you is whenever there was a decision being made around sanctions, and they're made at the highest levels, there's an impact assessment where there's all kinds of conversations around sort of what is the impact of these sanctions and how should we measure them? What are the humanitarian impacts of sanctions on Iran or Venezuela? And I'm confident there was a lot of conversation here around sort of the impact, of these sanctions. I think that the sort of we'll see. I think what the perspective that's kind of important is to understand sort of really how they were thinking. And I think how they were thinking is, look, we sanctioned the very first cryptocurrency address associated with North Korea. It was the address the funds went into after the Ronin hack. Okay, Treasury designated that address. And then what it decided to do was use blockchain analytics tools like TRM to follow the money. And it followed those funds into 3 additional addresses. It then sanctioned those addresses. Okay. It then watched the funds flow through blender.io. And what did it do? It sanctioned Blender, right? But the reality was more funds were flowing through Tornado Cash. And it was really this place that had been used over and over again by North Korea. And that is the activity that OFAC was trying to stop, was trying to curtail. There's been a lot of sort of collateral damage here. But I think the reality is like that was where the focus is. And now my hope is that additional guidance could sort of maybe get us a little closer to that, going after the illicit actors without sort of the unintended consequences of ensnaring, regular users. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being on, Ari. It was great to see you.
Great.